think stuff to do with family overwhelms me quite a bit. Worry or stress around family side of things, that does overwhelm me quite a bit.
Prince William has just cut off Queen Camilla's funding. This emergency freeze follows a tense midnight confrontation at Windsor Castle, where Prince Andrew exposed Camilla's deepest secret directly to King Charles. The private ledger for the Duchy of Cornwall went completely dark just hours ago. Now, the palace is in absolute freefall as a massive internal money war begins. The broken ledger. A single fountain pen sat on the mahogany desk inside Highgrove House. King Charles picked it up, then dropped it. His hands were shaking. Across from him stood Prince Andrew, holding a thick leather folder. It was 11 o'clock at night on October 12th, 2025. Andrew did not sit down. He simply slid the folder across the wood. Inside was a bank statement from a private firm in Zurich. The top of the page bore the name of Queen Camilla. Charles stared at the numbers. They did not match the official palace ledgers. For years, small amounts had migrated out of the estate. Andrew pointed a finger at the final line. It showed a massive transfer to an offshore trust. The king looked up, his face pale. He asked his brother where this came from. Andrew smiled slightly and said it came from the archives. The first mystery of the night was solved. The papers were genuine, but they opened a much larger question. Why was the queen hiding millions from her own husband? The tension in the room grew cold. Charles knew what this meant for the family. If these documents leaked, the press would tear the monarchy apart. Andrew knew it too. He had spent months planning this moment. He needed leverage, and he finally found it. Charles turned the pages slowly. Each sheet revealed a different transaction. The dates went back over a decade. Some transfers occurred during the transition of the crown. Others happened during major state visits. The money was moving quietly through secondary accounts. No one in the main financial office had noticed. The system was designed to overlook the Queen's personal transactions. Andrew pointed out a specific entry from 2024. It was a transfer of £500,000. The destination was an investment firm in the Cayman Islands. Charles sank deeper into his chair. He remembered that specific month. The family was dealing with massive public pressure. He was focusing on his health treatments. Camilla was managing the public diary alone. While the world watched her attend royal engagements, her lawyers were moving money across the world. Charles asked if anyone else had seen these files. Andrew shook his head. He claimed he came straight to the king, but Charles knew his brother too well. Andrew always kept a duplicate copy for safety. The room remained completely silent for several minutes. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Charles looked at the signature on the authorization form. It was a perfect match for Camilla's handwriting. There was no forgery here. This was a deliberate long-term operation. She was building a financial fortress outside the control of the British state. Charles looked closely at the oldest documents in the folder. The first transactions started long before the coronation. They dated back to their time as the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall. The early transfers were small, disguised as antique art purchases and private security adjustments. Andrew pointed to a receipt from a gallery in London. The gallery did not exist. It was a shell company registered to a lawyer who had managed Camilla's family estate for 30 years. The king tried to find an excuse. He suggested to Andrew that this was an old inheritance fund. Andrew laughed at the suggestion. He turned to a page containing a direct wire transfer from the Duchy of Lancaster. This was public money meant for the sovereign. It had been rerouted into a private foundation before landing in the Swiss account. Charles felt the room spin. This went beyond a private family dispute. It was a direct violation of constitutional agreements. Andrew leaned over the desk, his voice dropping to a whisper. He told his brother that this was just the first layer of the file. There were more accounts tied to properties in continental Europe. Charles looked at the fireplace. He thought about burning the papers right there, but he knew Andrew's nature. The Duke of York was playing a high-stakes game for his own survival. Destroying these specific sheets would change nothing. The digital trail remained intact on a hard drive somewhere outside the palace walls. Charles reached for his internal telephone line. He did not call his chief of staff. He did not call the palace lawyers. He dialed a private, encrypted number that bypassed the main switchboard entirely. He needed the one person who could legally freeze the assets before the press caught wind of the situation. He needed his heir. Prince William answered the phone on the second ring. He was at Adelaide Cottage, working late on his own estate ledgers. Charles did not explain the details over the phone. He simply told his son that an emergency had occurred at Highgrove. He ordered William to bring his private security team and come immediately. William heard the tremor in his father's voice. He did not ask questions. He simply agreed and hung up the phone. While they waited for the heir to arrive, Charles confronted Andrew about his motives. He demanded to know what Andrew wanted in exchange for the documents. Andrew did not hesitate. He stated his terms clearly. He wanted his full allowance restored. He wanted his security detail returned to Royal Lodge. He wanted his daughters to retain their official roles. It was blackmail, pure and simple. Charles sat back, realizing his own brother had trapped him. The clock struck midnight. The sound of a vehicle parking on the gravel outside signaled William's arrival. The car doors slammed hard. Footsteps echoed down the long hallway toward the study. The door opened, and the Prince of Wales walked in. He stopped when he saw his uncle sitting in the corner. William looked at the desk, his eyes fixing onto the leather folder. The second mystery of the night was about to unfold. William was about to discover exactly how deep the deception went. Andrew's final gamble. Prince Andrew stood in the shadow of the heavy curtains, watching his nephew skim the financial documents. The Duke of York knew this was his absolute last play. Over the previous 12 months, King Charles had systematically stripped away his remaining privileges. The Crown had evicted his staff from Buckingham Palace. His personal security team at Royal Lodge was gone, replaced by a private firm paid out of his own shrinking funds. Andrew was facing total social and financial exile within Windsor. He needed a shield against his brother's cleanup campaign. He found that shield 3 weeks earlier, in a place the palace staff had neglected for decades. During the clearing of the old naval records boxes in the Windsor archives, Andrew stumbled upon an unindexed storage crate. The crate contained personal letters and financial records from 1992. Among the dusty ledgers was a private file belonging to Queen Camilla. It was marked as private correspondence, but inside lay a series of modern banking contracts. Andrew spent 3 nights analyzing the documents with a trusted accountant. They discovered a hidden pipeline that allowed the Queen to bypass regular palace oversight. Andrew brought the leather folder straight to Highgrove because he knew the institutional courtiers would protect the Queen. If he went to the cabinet secretary, the truth would be buried under official secrets acts. The files proved that Camilla had maintained a secondary network of accounts since the late 90s. She used the capital to acquire prime real estate across the United Kingdom for her extended family, completely hidden from the sovereign's eyes. Charles sat in his chair, staring blankly at the wall as the reality of the betrayal settled in. He had trusted his wife completely to manage the transition of the Crown's private properties. William did not sit down. He stood directly under the chandelier, turning the pages with methodical precision. He did not look at his uncle. The relationship between the Prince of Wales and the Duke of York had been frozen for years. William had been the strongest voice in pushing Andrew out of public life. Now, his uncle was standing in the king's private office, holding the smoking gun that could ruin the family's reputation. Andrew broke the silence. He explained exactly how the pipeline operated. During the high-profile transition of the Duchy of Lancaster assets, certain administrative accounts were left open. Camilla's private financial advisors utilized these gaps to move funds into the Swiss accounts. It was a sophisticated operation that required deep knowledge of the palace banking system. The small questions were fading. The massive question now was how William would protect the Crown's institutional survival. William stopped on a page detailing a major transfer from 2023. The transaction occurred just weeks before the coronation ceremony. It was a time of immense national scrutiny. While the public debated the cost of the royal event, hundreds of thousands of pounds were quietly exiting the main accounts. The recipient was a holding company based in the British Virgin Islands. William's expression hardened. As the head of the Duchy of Cornwall, he was legally responsible for the financial integrity of the heir's estate. This cross-accounting touched his own jurisdiction. Andrew watched his nephew closely, waiting for the anger. Instead, William showed pure calculation. The prince knew that his uncle's sudden loyalty was entirely transactional. Andrew did not bring these papers out of a sense of duty to the king. He brought them to save himself from bankruptcy. Andrew reiterated his demands, his voice rising slightly in the quiet room. He wanted a written guarantee that his residence at Royal Lodge would be secured for the next 20 years. He wanted his state-funded security reinstated immediately. Charles looked toward his son, silently asking for guidance. The king was emotionally spent, caught between the betrayal of his wife and the blackmail of his brother. But William was already moving ahead. He shut the leather folder with a heavy thud. He looked at Andrew and stated that the crown would not be dictated to by anyone. He told his uncle that his presence was no longer required at Highgrove. Andrew began to protest, pointing at the folder, but William stepped toward the door. He repeated the command, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Andrew realized he had unleashed a force he could not control. He had successfully damaged Camilla, but he had also handed total authority to his nephew. The Duke bowed his head slightly and exited into the dark hallway, leaving the father and son alone. William turned the key in the study door. The family security crisis was managed for the next few hours, but the structural crisis within the monarchy was just beginning. The shadow in the archives. Prince William walked over to the windows, pulling the heavy drapes shut against the early morning light. The folder remained on the desk, its white pages gleaming under the desk lamp. With Prince Andrew gone, the atmosphere in the room shifted from panic to absolute tactical planning. King Charles had not moved from his chair. He looked down at his hands, still trying to process how the woman he had loved for decades could maintain such an extensive parallel life. William did not offer comfort. He reopened the folder to the section detailing the foreign accounts. The documents revealed that the Swiss accounts were merely a transit point. The real destination for the diverted funds was a network of commercial properties in continental Europe, specifically targeting high-end developments in France and Germany. The earliest purchases began in 2018, during a period when the public was assured that the royal family was streamlining its holdings. The properties were held under anonymous corporate names, but the underlying funding guarantees bore Camilla's personal signature. William traced his finger down a spreadsheet detailing a luxury estate near Bordeaux. The purchase had been completed using a secondary financial channel tied to the Duchy of Lancaster. This was the sovereign's private estate, meant exclusively to provide income for the reigning monarch. William looked at his father and asked if he had signed any off-the-books exemptions for these properties. Charles shook his head slowly. He explained that he had signed dozens of routine management papers during his mother's final years, trusting the administrative staff completely. It was clear that the system had been manipulated from within. The small mystery of where the money went was resolved. It was locked in European brick and mortar, far out of the reach of British tax authorities. But this created a much darker problem for the heir. William knew that if the Parliamentary Public Accounts Committee ever audited these specific transactions, the political fallout would be catastrophic. The modern monarchy existed on a delicate foundation of public consent. If the public discovered the Queen was building a private property empire abroad using funds derived from public assets, the institution might not survive. William turned the page to look at the German holdings. These transactions were handled by a boutique legal firm based in Frankfurt. The firm specialized in setting up private foundations that protected the identities of ultra-wealthy beneficiaries. According to the timeline in Andrew's dossier, a massive transfer occurred in 2022, right around the time of the late Queen's Platinum Jubilee. While the nation celebrated traditional stability, Camilla's advisors were rushing to anchor millions of pounds into stable European commercial real estate. The Prince of Wales closed his eyes for a moment, calculating the timeline. This was not a collection of random investments. It was a highly organized exit strategy. Camilla was creating a completely independent financial baseline that would remain untouched by the British Crown or the government, regardless of what happened to the monarchy's future. William realized that his stepmother had never fully trusted the institutional stability of the family she married into. She had built a back door out of the palace. Charles finally spoke, his voice cracked with exhaustion. He asked his son what they should do with the German files. William looked straight at his father and stated that the documentation must be secured in the private archives at Windsor Castle immediately. No courtiers, no secretaries, and no government ministers could know the contents of this folder. William picked up the thick leather book. He told his father that he was going to handle the immediate financial response himself. He would not wait for an official palace committee to deliberate. The power over the royal purse strings was about to be used as a weapon. William draws the line, Prince. William walked out of the study and headed straight for the library across the hall. He needed space to think without his father's anxious pacing filling the room. The thick leather folder remained tucked firmly under his arm. Outside the windows, the grounds of Highgrove House were perfectly still, bathed in the gray mist of early dawn. It was 5 o'clock in the morning on October 13th. William placed his secure government-issued tablet on the long reading table. He unlocked the device using his biometric scan, opening the private internal network of the Duchy of Cornwall. As the Prince of Wales, William held absolute legal authority over this vast estate. It was an ancient portfolio of land, properties, and financial investments worth over £1 billion. Its primary purpose was to fund the public, private, and charitable activities of the heir to the throne and his immediate family. However, through a series of historic intra-family covenants signed during the reign of the late Queen, the Duchy also provided secondary operational liquidity to the Queen's office. These funds paid for her private secretarial staff, her travel logistics, and the maintenance of her personal wardrobe for international state visits. William pulled up the live digital spreadsheet for the current quarter's allocations. He zoomed in on a specific ledger category labeled as Internal Administrative Transfers. There it was. A scheduled payment of £450,000 was set to be cleared for the Queen's household in exactly 4 days. William stared at the digital ledger. For years, he had tried to modernize the family's finances, pushing for total transparency. Now he saw that the system he inherited was being used as a shield to mask offshore movements. William tapped the screen to open an encrypted communication channel to the Secretary of the Duchy Treasury. The secretary was a senior financial official who had spent 2 decades managing the estate's complex banking architecture. William did not hesitate. He typed out a direct executive order. He instructed the Treasury to immediately place an absolute administrative freeze on all discretionary funding lines connected to the Queen's household account. The wording was cold, precise, and legally binding. The system required a secondary verification code, known only to the prince himself. William entered the alphanumeric key without a moment of hesitation. The screen flashed from blue to amber, indicating that the transaction pipeline was locked. The money stopped in its tracks. Within minutes, the operational budget for Queen Camilla's entire public apparatus was completely paralyzed. Her staff would soon find their official procurement cards declined. Her travel planners would be unable to book transport for the upcoming autumn tour. William sat back, his face set in a hard line. He knew this action would trigger an immediate seismic shock within the palace walls. It was an unprecedented exercise of financial power by an heir apparent against a reigning queen consort. Never before in modern royal history had a Prince of Wales used his independent economic leverage to strip a senior sovereign partner of her operational resources. It was a declaration of total internal war. The library door opened quietly. King Charles walked in, holding a cup of black coffee that he had poured himself in the staff kitchen. He looked at the glowing tablet screen, then looked at his son. He asked William if he had actually gone through with the freeze. William looked his father dead in the eye and confirmed it. He stated that the funding would remain blocked until a team of independent forensic accountants went through every single invoice submitted by Camilla's office over the last 5 years. Charles tried to protest, his voice hushed but desperate. He argued that cutting off her funds would create immediate operational chaos. He reminded William that the Queen was scheduled to attend a major national charity gala in London the following evening. If her styling team and security logistics had no clearance, the public would notice the disruption immediately. The press would begin asking questions about a rift within the palace hierarchy. William refused to back down. He pointed at the leather folder on the table. He reminded his father that the risk of a press leak regarding the Zurich and Frankfurt accounts was infinitely more dangerous than a cancelled public engagement. If the public discovered that the Crown was covering up secret offshore real estate purchases while the nation faced economic hardship, the monarchy would face an existential crisis. William stated that he was protecting his own future crown, even if it meant forcing an immediate crisis within his father's household. The king realized he could not overrule the decision. Legally, the Duchy of Cornwall belonged entirely to the Prince of Wales. The sovereign had no constitutional power to reverse a financial directive issued by the Duke of Cornwall regarding his own estate revenues. Charles ran a hand over his face, looking completely defeated. He had spent decades defending Camilla against public criticism and internal palace resistance. Now, his own son had managed to dismantle her domestic power base in a single morning. William stood up from the table, picking up both his tablet and the dossier. He told his father that they needed to return to the main study. The next phase of the crisis required immediate tactical management. Camilla was currently residing at her private estate in Wiltshire, completely unaware that her financial lifeline had been severed. William looked out at the sunrise, knowing that when the palace offices opened in 3 hours, the true battle for control of the monarchy's future would begin. Highgrove behind, closed doors. The grandfather clock in the main hallway struck 8 o'clock in the morning. The quiet of Highgrove House evaporated as the morning staff began arriving through the rear entrance. King Charles remained in his study, sitting at the desk with his head in his hands. Prince William stood by the doorway, his tablet showing the first wave of internal alerts from the financial offices in London. The funding freeze had taken effect. The electronic payment network for the Queen's household had rejected its first routine transaction of the morning, a maintenance invoice for her official vehicles. The sound of tires on the gravel drive announced a sudden arrival. William moved to the window and pulled the curtain aside. A dark sedan had pulled up to the front steps without the usual police escort. The door opened and Queen Camilla stepped out into the damp morning air. She had driven directly from her private home at Mill House in Wiltshire. Her expression was tight, her movements hurried. Someone within the palace communications network had already alerted her that her official household credit accounts were suddenly locked. Camilla entered the study without knocking. She stopped when she saw William standing beside the king's desk. She looked between the father and the son, her eyes instantly dropping to the thick leather folder sitting between them. The small mystery of why she had rushed to Highgrove was resolved. She knew exactly what that folder contained. She did not speak to William. She looked directly at her husband and asked him what was happening with the accounts. Charles did not look up immediately. When he did, his voice was barely a whisper. He asked her about the Zurich accounts. He asked her about the property investments in France. The confrontation was not loud, but the emotional weight in the room was crushing. Camilla did not deny the existence of the funds. Instead, she stepped closer to the desk and defended her choices. She stated that she had built that financial cushion to ensure her own independence and security for the future. William stepped forward, cutting off the discussion before it could turn into an emotional debate. He stated that personal independence did not justify the manipulation of crown assets. He pulled up a document on his screen showing a specific transaction from 2023. It was a line item entry for a phantom renovation project on a royal property. The funds had actually been diverted to a private foundation in Frankfurt. William looked at his stepmother and demanded a full explanation for the shell companies. Camilla turned her attention to the heir to the throne. The tension between the two had existed for decades, hidden behind polite public smiles and shared engagements. Now, behind closed doors, the mask fell away completely. She told William that he did not understand the reality of her position within the family. She had spent 20 years being scrutinized by the public and the press. She argued that she needed a secure baseline that was entirely her own, free from the control of the shifting political winds of the state. The argument shifted to the concrete details of the layout of the royal estate. William revealed that the audit had uncovered a secret clause in a property management contract. The clause allowed certain revenues from royal land holdings to bypass the central treasury entirely. It was an arrangement that had been quietly set up by a former palace accountant who had since retired to the Isle of Wight. The discovery of this specific mechanism solved the larger question of how the money had moved undetected for so long. Charles finally stood up from his chair. The betrayal was not just financial, it was deeply personal. He reminded Camilla that he had changed royal protocols to ensure her comfort and standing within the monarchy. He had fought battles with politicians and church leaders to bring her into the center of royal life. To discover that she had spent that entire time building a secret exit strategy abroad was a devastating blow to his trust. He looked at the floor, unable to maintain eye contact with his wife. William laid out the terms of the financial quarantine. The freeze on the Duchy of Cornwall allowance would remain absolute. Camilla's public office would receive enough basic funding to cover existing staff salaries for the next 30 days, but all discretionary spending was canceled. Her private legal and financial advisors would be required to hand over the full keys to the offshore trusts to a designated team of Crown lawyers. Every single asset held in continental Europe would have to be declared to the central treasury. Camilla realized she had no cards left to play. She looked at her husband, searching for any sign of support, but the king remained silent, staring out at the gardens. The power dynamic within the royal family had permanently shifted. William was no longer just the heir waiting in the wings. He was actively dictating the terms of survival for the current household. Camilla picked up her leather gloves from the desk, turned on her heel, and walked out of the room without saying another word. The heavy oak door closed with a firm click. William looked at his father and stated that they needed to prepare for the administrative fallout. The Queen's staff would be demanding answers within the hour. The press office at Buckingham Palace would need a coordinated narrative to explain the sudden cancellation of her upcoming public appearances. The internal war had been won by the heir, but the task of keeping the public from discovering the true fracture was about to begin. The palace money war goes public. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, on October 14th, 2025, the silence inside the central press office at Buckingham Palace was broken by the constant ringing of external telephone lines. Senior communications officers paced the floor, holding printouts of the early edition evening papers. The financial quarantine implemented by Prince William was already leaking into the secondary layers of the British media. While the mainstream television networks remained quiet, alternative online news outlets and investigative royal blogs began publishing highly specific details about a sudden budgetary collapse inside the Queen's household. The first public sign of trouble occurred when a prominent political correspondent posted a copy of an internal memo on a social media platform. The memo, leaked from a mid-level administrator within the Central Treasury, stated that all corporate purchasing cards issued to the staff at Clarence House had been summarily suspended. Within 30 minutes, a secondary report emerged from a financial journalist tracking aviation logistics. The report noted that a private charter flight, booked for the Queen's upcoming departure to a cultural summit in Munich, had been abruptly canceled due to non-payment of the mandatory handling fees. Inside the communications hub, the staff scrambled to construct a defensive narrative. They could not issue a standard boilerplate denial because the operational disruption was too visible. The small question of how the press had picked up the story so quickly was resolved when an audit of the Palace digital network showed an authorized download of the frozen ledger file from a terminal located near the royal stables. A low-level clerk had noticed the dramatic change in the duchy's automated payout schedule and had tipped off a contact Fleet Street reporter. William arrived at the London press office just after 3 o'clock, accompanied by his private legal counsel. He did not go to the main briefing room. Instead, he took over a private conference room on the second floor, overlooking the palace quadrangle. He called the head of the royal communications team into the room and laid out a strict strategy of complete information containment. William stated that under no circumstances was any official spokesperson to comment on the Zurich accounts, the offshore trusts, or the involvement of Prince Andrew. The communications director warned the prince that a total wall of silence would only fuel more extreme media speculation. The newspapers were already framing the story as a massive personal rift between the king and the heir over the long-term management of the sovereign grant. One major tabloid was preparing a front-page layout for the following morning, with a headline focusing on a constitutional standoff over the family's private wealth. The editor had given the palace exactly 2 hours to provide an official response before the presses began rolling. William remained entirely unmoved by the pressure. He leaned over the conference table and stated that the press could speculate about a family disagreement all they wanted. A domestic dispute over budgeting was a temporary public relations issue that could be managed with a few carefully staged joint public appearances later in the month. However, a verified revelation about an unvouched offshore property empire held by the Queen Consort would trigger an immediate parliamentary inquiry by the Public Accounts Committee. That scenario had to be avoided at all costs. The legal team presented a drafted statement designed to minimize the damage while acknowledging the operational freeze. The text claimed that the Crown was currently undergoing a routine mid-term administrative restructuring of its various household budgets to ensure maximum efficiency and alignment with modern public standards. The statement explained that during this transitionary phase, certain discretionary funding lines had been temporarily centralized under the direct supervision of the Prince of Wales's financial office. It was a masterpiece of dry, bureaucratic misdirection. The larger question of whether the public would accept this explanation began to clear as the afternoon progressed. A secondary crisis erupted when an independent financial blog published a list of corporate registration numbers linked to a commercial holding company in Frankfurt. The blog did not openly name Camilla, but it explicitly pointed out that the company's legal representatives were the exact same lawyers who had managed her personal family trusts since her marriage into the royal family. The connection was becoming dangerously obvious to anyone with an internet connection and a basic understanding of corporate registry data. William immediately used his secure line to contact the Home Secretary. He did not ask for a political favor. He simply provided a brief briefing on the potential national security implications of an unvouched foreign asset trail linked to the reigning sovereign's household. He requested that the government's Central Communications Unit issue a standard guidance note to the main broadcast editors, reminding them of the strict privacy protocols governing the financial affairs of the immediate members of the royal family. The government complied within 20 minutes, successfully slowing down the story's spread on main television networks. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the internal money war was accelerating. Camilla's private financial secretary, operating from an office in Wiltshire, sent an urgent encrypted memo to William's legal team. The memo stated that if the discretionary funding freeze was not partially lifted by noon the following day, the Queen's office would be legally forced to default on its existing contractual obligations to several private security firms and logistics suppliers based in continental Europe. This move would automatically trigger legal filings in open courts abroad, making the hidden property records part of the public domain. William read the ultimatum and refused to compromise. He turned to his chief financial officer and ordered him to use funds from the independent reserves of the Duchy of Cornwall to directly pay off the immediate operational debts of Camilla's suppliers. By paying the foreign companies directly from the heir's estate, William bypassed Camilla's private network entirely, preventing any court filings while maintaining his absolute stranglehold over her domestic budget. He was effectively taking over her entire household infrastructure, piece by piece, turning her staff into direct employees of his own office. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the mainstream evening news broadcasts led with the story of the palace financial restructuring. The presenters used the exact bureaucratic phrasing provided by William's legal team. They focused their commentary on the prince's known desire to create a streamlined modern monarchy. The narrative was successfully shifted from a scandalous betrayal to a story about an ambitious heir tightening the family purse strings to protect the taxpayer. The immediate public relations disaster was contained, but the tension within the palace walls had reached a boiling point. A crown. Divided by 8 o'clock in the evening on October 15th, the structural architecture of the British monarchy had fundamentally changed. Prince William arrived back at the private gates of Windsor Castle, carrying the leather folder containing the original Zurich transaction files. He passed through the security checkpoint without stopping for the usual evening briefing from the castle governor. He walked straight to the royal library, entering the climate-controlled vault, where the most sensitive sovereign records are preserved. He placed the dossier into a reinforced security locker, entering a new master access code known only to his immediate staff. The internal power struggle had ended in a decisive, quiet coup, with Queen Camilla isolated at her private estate in Wiltshire, and her operational funding completely controlled by the Duchy of Cornwall. William had effectively established himself as the ultimate gatekeeper of the crown's institutional survival. King Charles remained at Highgrove House, emotionally exhausted and functionally dependent on his son's management of the unfolding administrative fallout. The traditional hierarchy, where the reigning sovereign held total domestic authority over the family, was broken. The small mystery of how Prince Andrew would react to his exclusion from the final settlement was resolved when a security detail reported his departure from Royal Lodge. Realizing that William refused to honor his original blackmail demands, Andrew had retreated back into social exile, his leverage entirely neutralized. He had successfully damaged Camilla's standing, but he had failed to regain his own official titles or state-funded security. William had taken his uncle's information, used it to protect the estate, and closed the palace doors firmly behind him. The larger question carrying forward into the future was how the family would maintain their public unity during the upcoming state openings and national ceremonies. The public believed the dry press releases explaining the sudden budgetary restructuring as a modernization program. However, behind the palace walls, the fracture was absolute. Camilla's senior secretaries were now required to submit weekly operational logs directly to William's Treasury team for forensic approval. Every travel arrangement, wardrobe purchase, and charitable patronage was subject to a strict financial veto held by the heir apparent. William sat down at the library desk, opening his digital tablet to review the upcoming royal calendar for 2026. He began systematically removing secondary joint engagements that required the king and queen to appear alongside his own household. He was creating a clear, structural separation between his future court and the compromised infrastructure of his father's current reign. The money war was won, the offshore assets were quarantined, and the legal lines were drawn. The modern crown was officially divided, and the Prince of Wales was already ruling from the shadows.